now.
Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today, we're doing a book club episode with Matthew Emadi, and he wrote a book called The Royal Priest, Psalm 110 in Biblical Theology, and it's part of the New Studies in Biblical Theology series by IVP Academic. And you guys on YouTube can see his copy here. We've had a few authors from the New Studies in Biblical Theology on, and so he is the new edition that we are recording here. And we're going to be talking about Melchizedek, and very interesting topic. It's going to be a fun conversation. As show notes reminders, if you go to our show notes, click that link to IVP Academic. It'll take you straight to the New Studies in Biblical Theology part of their page, and you'll see this book among the many others in that series. And that series editor is D.A. Carson. So I'm actually going to read the endorsement D.A. Carson had on Matthew's book here. D.A. says, depending on exactly how one counts the occurrences, Psalm 110 is the Old Testament chapter quoted or alluded to most frequently in the New Testament. Dr. Emadi's work will not only stimulate fresh levels of biblical theological integration, but will enliven and enrich the sermons of pastors who plumb this book with care it deserves. So if you guys go to our show notes as well, you'll see some other information like a link to find the closest Reformed or confessional church near your area, resources on how to contact or communicate with Peter and myself, and other resources that are helpful during these book club episodes and our current season we're on apologetics. So we'll jump into this conversation here. I'll let Peter further introduce Matthew Emadi today.
Yeah, we have Dr. Matthew Emadi. He's a senior pastor of Crossroads Church in Sandy, Utah. And we'll talk about Utah a little bit because it's pertinent for this conversation as well. He holds a PhD in biblical studies from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and is the author of How Can I Serve My Church in the 9 Marks Church Question series. It is a pleasure to have you on our show, Dr. Emadi.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Excited to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, kind of on-ramp question, which is not on the questions that I sent you earlier. What was it like playing Division I basketball?
Oh, man, good question. It feels like a former life. It was fun in a lot of ways. The competitive level, the intensity of the practices, just being in that world, the travel.
Yeah, I miss athletics in college so much.
Oh, well, real quick, what
I played baseball in college, baseball and a little bit of football.
Yeah, I mean, it was just to be at that level of shape and athleticism.
Yeah.
I mean, it was great. Now there was also challenges too, because Division I sports, I mean,
it's so hard to do school with.
Yeah, it's your job.
It is.
So in some ways I miss it. In some ways I'm glad to move on.
Yeah. Fun fact. I think people on the podcast are I flunked my first year of college because of athletics. Because you have to devote your life to athletics. And I thought I was smart to just do it on my own. And I just got smoked in my first year. And I was like, I can't do this anymore.
It is all consuming. Pretty much all consuming. So
totally. So to learn more about yourself, let our listeners know a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in writing The Royal Priest.
Yeah, so I'm married to my wonderful wife, Brittany. We have 6 kids, age 12 and under, 5 boys and 1 girl.
Are you in like a competition for most kids with you and your brother, or what?
No competition, but I win that competition.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a busy season of life, exhausting, but great. So how did I get into this topic? I went to seminary at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I decided to, after I did my MDiv, to keep going, do a PhD.
To stay there longer.
Yeah. Jim Hamilton was my supervisor. He's excellent biblical theologian. And I didn't know what to write on for my dissertation, but I had been reflecting on Hebrews. And so obviously Psalm 110 is a critical part of the argument of Hebrews.
Plays a major role. Yep.
Yeah, and I think just reading Hebrews
Like multiple times too. It's not just once. It's like
it's all over the place. I mean, it's all over the place. It's part. I mean, it's essential to the logic of the entire argument. And I think I was reflecting on sonship, priesthood, and kingship in Jesus, and why the author of Hebrews is kind of weaving these all these three things together. And so I just started asking questions about Psalm 110, and I narrowed down the question to, how did David come to the conclusion that the Messiah would be both a priest and a king beyond just his reflections on Genesis 14? And so I think that's how I started. As I started reading the literature, I thought, well, maybe this is an angle to approach this particular psalm and ask this question. I think that's kind of how it surfaced in my mind, and it ended up being really relevant to my own ministry context, as we can talk about being out here in Utah. So
that's right. Yeah, totally.
Very cool. Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to jump into my first question here. And you mentioned Genesis 14. Melchizedek shows up in Genesis 14, verses 18 to 20, when he blesses Abraham. And yet, seems so pivotal to Psalm 110, obviously. So those are the two times in the Old Testament Melchizedek shows up. Genesis 14, and then Psalm 110. We'll talk a little bit about how there's some reference to Genesis 1 and 2 farther into the show, but primarily Genesis 14, Psalm 110. Can you actually read Psalm 110? Seems very appropriate for this conversation, since we're building it
short,
around.
so it shouldn't take that long.
And describe how you approach the text in the light of how little we know about Melchizedek, because it seems David says more about him than we kind of think initially.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's totally appropriate just to read Psalm 110.
Yeah, totally.
We have this discussion. So Psalm 110, I'm reading out of the ESV, the Psalm of David. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power. In holy garments from the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head. So yeah, it's a short psalm, and you're right. This is the only other place in the Old Testament other than Genesis 14 where Melchizedek's name appears. So my assumption approaching this text was that David was reflecting on Genesis 14 to develop his theology of the Messiah. As I started getting into the literature, I realized most critical approaches to Psalm 110 say that Genesis 14, the Melchizedek episode in Genesis 14, was redacted at a later point. It was inserted into Genesis to kind of, for political purposes, so that it would create a political alliance between the Davidic monarchy and the Jebusite priesthood. When David conquered Jerusalem, he had, there was these kind of political goals, so that this story needed to be inserted into this narrative about Abraham to show this connection between Abraham and a Canaanite priest king, to kind of now create this alliance, this blending of these political roles in the Davidic monarchy. And I just thought, I don't think that's the case. I think Genesis 14 and the Melchizedek episode is original to Genesis. I think it does make sense within the flow of the narrative. And I think David was reflecting on that passage in light of the promises that God had made to him in the Davidic covenant, and also the patterns of his own life to come to these conclusions. So that's why I thought, well, we just need to press in deeper. Even though Melchizedek only appears there, it doesn't mean he's insignificant. And I think there has to be clues in the text that led David to this interpretation and to this conclusion. Because another alternative, a conservative alternative, is to say, well, David received some new special revelation because there's just not enough information here for him to come to this conclusion. And I obviously believe that David's words in Psalm 110 are inspired, but I don't think it's the product of some new, fresh revelation. I think it's inspired text, but I think it's inspired based on his reading of the Old Testament. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, so he's not bringing anything new to the table per se. He's reading the Old Testament in a way that I think people are not used to reading it in.
Right.
And seeing, and seeing the connections, and then under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, making those connections and help like bringing us along with the text.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Gotcha. Cool.
Very good. And the other big person in this part of this Melchizedek kind of framework story is our father in the faith, Abraham. So attached to this, why does Melchizedek show up to Abraham in Genesis 14 specifically?
Yeah, so I think Melchizedek's significance is his connection to Abraham. I mean, it sounds weird to say it this way, but he doesn't show up to Noah. God's covenant with Noah is about preservation, right? He's not going to flood the world again. It's kind of this reinstallment of Adam's role, right? Human government being established, the protection of life, all these things. But Abraham is associated with these promises of redemption and blessing to the nations. So I think it's significant that in the flow of Genesis, Melchizedek appears and is associated with Abraham, the recipient of the promises. And so I think we have to understand Melchizedek and his importance in light of Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant. Now, in the narrative itself, in Genesis 14, Melchizedek appears to Abraham after his victory in battle. And part of the point of the narrative is the contrast that's being presented between two kings, the king of Sodom and the king of Salem.
Mm-hmm.
And the kinds of kingship that Abraham is being confronted with are different kinds of kingship. There's the king of Sodom, which represents a kind of worldly kingship who wants power and authority over people, and is trying to strike this deal with Abraham. Hey, you take these things, I'll take these things. But then you have Melchizedek, who blesses Abraham, who acknowledges God's sovereignty over creation and the one who has given Abraham victory in battle. And Abraham is being presented with this choice of which kind of kingship is he going to identify with? Kingship that is servant kingship under the sovereign rule of God. And is he going to identify with Melchizedek and continue to walk by faith and receive the promises by faith? Or is he going to identify with the king of Sodom, where might makes right and this kind of worldly logic? And Abraham chooses to side with Melchizedek, and Melchizedek's God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so we'll dig a little bit further into this too, because and it's not a random showing up to Abraham. It's connected to the Abrahamic covenant. And like you said, this book is not just tracing the theme of kingship and priesthood, and we'll define some of these things too throughout both Old and New Testament along the lines of Psalm 110, though it does touch on that. You're trying to understand why Psalm 110. So you're not just saying oh, he shows up and this is why he shows up. You're trying to, like you said, you're trying to show why Psalm 110 makes such a big deal out of Melchizedek when it seems like you've got 3 verses in Genesis to work off of. You're like, okay, David, I get it, but man, it seems like you're kind of importing some stuff into this. You're kind of reading some stuff into the Melchizedek episode. So how is David reading Old Testament history, and how does this inform how we read the Old Testament history as well?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, the sun is coming out and I'm starting to glow. So unless you think I'm extra spiritual.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I like it.
Okay, I think that's
works.
probably better. Yeah, so I think David is reading Old Testament history covenantally.
Mhm.
I think he's reading.
He's not just pulling a rabbit out of a 3-verse hat.
Yeah. In other words, even though Melchizedek only appears for a few verses, he's situated within a bigger narrative.
Mhm.
And he's part of the story that's unfolding. And so I think, like I said earlier, David is reading Melchizedek's episode in light of the promises of the Davidic covenant that have been made to him, in light of the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. And he's reading about Melchizedek as part of this unity of story that's begun with Adam, right? This kind of archetypal priest king in the garden. And he's making these connections so that as he receives the promises from God, that one of his sons is going to sit on a throne and reign over the kingdom. He's seeing Melchizedek and his priesthood being attached to the Abrahamic covenant as significant and important and enduring in a way that the Levitical priesthood attached to the law is not.
Because
And
they
so,
died. Yeah.
Yeah, they die, they're attached to this Mosaic covenant. But I think David is saying, you know what? The covenant that God has made with him and the promises that God has made to David, these are going to carry forward the promises God made to Abraham. The blessing of the nations is going to come through my seed. That's what David is thinking. And what is the priesthood attached to the Abrahamic covenant? Well, it's this Melchizedekian priesthood. And it's this Melchizedekian priesthood that's going to be able to mediate these promises and the blessing of Abraham to the nation.
Because you get Genesis 12 with the blessing coming through Abraham to all generations after him.
Exactly. So I think David is reading Old Testament history covenantally and seeing his place within the story. And seeing that there is going to be a priesthood that is attached to the Abrahamic covenant and is of a certain kind of priesthood that is going to be able to carry these promises forward.
Real quick, before my next question, one that popped up in my head too, because through reading your book and studying this a little bit, there's a relationship maybe here between Abraham and future Israel too, like as far as like the name of where Melchizedek is a king from. So Shalom.
Yep. Right.
So it could point towards Jerusalem. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. In fact, is it Psalm 72 associates Salem with Jerusalem. And yeah, so you've got this king of righteousness, right? Melchizedek, king of righteousness, that's what his name means, who is a priest, who is a king of Salem, meaning peace, which is associated with Jerusalem, who comes out to bring bread and wine to Abraham, to bless him. And so Melchizedek himself mirrors David in some ways. You know, David, even though he doesn't hold the office of priesthood according to the Mosaic law, he functions in a kind of priestly way in the narratives of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And so I think David kind of saw himself, you know, when he brings the ark to Jerusalem, when he's passing out gifts and blessing and leading the sacrifices coming in, as this priestly figure of a different order. And he's thinking,
which is what Melchizedek does in Genesis 14.
Yeah, exactly. He blesses Abraham. So, you know, and like you're saying, I mean,
leaves him gifts. Yeah. Abraham pays a tithe to him. Yeah.
Abraham is the father of Israel, right? And so, and David himself now becomes the agent of blessing to God's people, Israel. So there's all these kinds of, there's a web of connections that keep coming back to, I think, as David is reflecting on his life, on the storyline of Scripture, on God's covenant, that keep coming back to David and the promises God made with him. I didn't say it earlier, but even in 2 Samuel 7, when God makes the promises to David, David responds in 2 Samuel 7:19. This is the Torah, well, the Torah of Adam in the Hebrew. This is the charter of humanity. This is the law of mankind, right? It seems like he's saying, the promises that you have made to me, are carrying forward your creation project, what you intended from the beginning with Adam to do for all of humanity. Now you're going to do through my son, so that God's purposes for creation to have these kinds of people who are priests, kings, dwelling in his presence, expanding his kingdom, now is going to be carried forward through David's greater son.
That's good. That's good. Thanks for answering that curveball out of nowhere question I had. That wasn't.
No, that's good.
Yeah. So now let's talk a little bit about the union of priesthood and kinship in Psalm 110. And it doesn't occur for much of the old, that union of priesthood and kinship in Psalm 110 doesn't occur for much of the Old Testament outside of Genesis 1 and 2. So I guess this question is going to be kind of going back to how this unionship is related to Genesis 1 and 2 in the garden. What is so vital for the union of these two offices and how they're combined into one person, especially to leave off describing the prophetic office, obviously, that one Psalm 110 both points backwards from and forward too.
Yeah, that's a good question, because it seems like the union of priesthood and kingship in a single person or persons is the creation ideal. After the fall, Genesis 3, and as redemptive history develops, the two offices get formalized, we could say, and separated in the Mosaic and Davidic covenants, right? You've got separate jurisdictions for priesthood and kingship that aren't to encroach upon each other's jurisdiction.
You don't have a priest who serves as a king. You don't have a king who serves as a priest.
Exactly. But prior to that, in the beginning, the kind of ideal picture is Adam, who is made in the image of God, who is God's son, right? He's made to represent God's rule. And so as God's son, he is a king, commissioned to take dominion over the earth, right? This is kind of standard stuff. And he's also placed in the Garden of Eden as a priest. We have that language of Adam working and keeping the garden. It's the language of the priesthood. In later texts, he's to protect the boundaries of sacred space, right? Yep. He's to cultivate the garden and be fruitful and multiply. So
sound very Bealian.
Yeah, this is G.K. Beale, right? That the garden will expand and grow. God's temple will cover the earth, and his glory will cover the earth.
Who gets it from Meredith Kline? Who gets it from other people before him?
Exactly. Yeah. This is all
music to my ears.
Yeah, this is great stuff. I mean, it's that creation ideal that is to be reflected in humanity, that God makes humanity who, to be his royal son and priests and kings, worshiping, ordering their life around the worship of him and ruling under his ultimate sovereignty. And so I think that's why the union of these two offices is important, is because it points back to that creational ideal. And then it moving forward, David sees the Messiah as holding both of these offices, because I think David sees the Messiah as an expression of the true image of God, the fullness of the image of God, one who is a son of God and who is a king and a priest, who has access to God's presence and who holds these offices permanently. And so why Melchizedek though here? Why not just appeal to Adam and his priesthood? And I think it's again because Melchizedek is unique in that his royal priesthood connects both to the creation covenant and what we find in Adam. It's patterned after that, but also because it is uniquely attached to the promises to Abraham. And so David hones in on Melchizedek for those reasons and says the Messiah, the one who's coming in the future, he's going to bring these offices back together as God intended it in the beginning, in this kind of creational ideal. And then in the book of Hebrews, which we'll get to, we see those things being fulfilled in Jesus.
Yeah, it's just still a hope and a promise in a post-fall world.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Even though the offices are institutionalized and separated, there's still this kind of hope for them being brought together, this return to Eden and the ideal human. There's other language in Psalm 110 that reflects back to, to even Genesis with sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.
Crushing the serpent. Yep.
Yeah, you've got serpent, crushing the serpent. You got parallels to Psalm 8.
Yep.
Who's David's reflection on humanity, and he's basically reflecting on Genesis 1:26 through 28 and what it means to be made in the image of God. So you've got all these kinds of connections, and I think we're meant to read the Bible this way, with Scripture, interpreting Scripture, and relying on Scripture, and David is teaching us and showing us that that's what he's doing.
Yeah, and I don't want to take us too far afield, but I think this is helpful because you talk about this in your book. Because even David himself seems to pre-type like a kingly priest in some aspects, because he does take I think it's not sure, it's the bread from the temple.
Yeah, exactly.
He does things that you're not supposed to do as a king if you're not anointed as a priest, and he doesn't get chastised for it.
Right.
Which you talk about in your book. Like there's a preview of a king who takes on priestly duties there too.
Yeah, he wears the linen ephod, like Sam. We get these details.
Yeah, stuff you can't do if you're a king, if you're not anointed as a priest.
Yeah, why is he doing? Why is he wearing the linen ephod? And then he's, he offers a sacrifice after his sinful census, at the threshing floor of Arona, the Jebusite.
Which is a king doesn't do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this is Mount Moriah, and so it's like he's in his life, he's doing priestly behaviors.
Yep.
And he's not from the tribe of Levi.
Yeah, not anointed as a priest. Yeah, not commissioned as a priest.
It's like he is a priest of a different order.
Yeah.
And so again, I think that contributes to his understanding of the messianic hope.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that doesn't necessarily bring me to my next question, but it's kind of the opposite, which is helpful to, I think, think through as well. You've also previewed some of this stuff, but I think some conservative evangelicals might have their own opinion about Melchizedek. It may not be formed by the Old Testament kind of structure and form, but what are some of the theories or interpretations surrounding Melchizedek and his priesthood that you also deal with in your book, and how might you respond to them?
Yeah, there's a lot of theories. I think three of the most common are the one I already mentioned, the kind of critical approach to the Bible that sees the Melchizedek story as just a redacted story that was inserted later. So it was just kind of maybe invented in that view. I don't buy that view. No. Scott Hahn, in his book, Kinship by Covenant, has a pretty lengthy section, if I remember correctly, arguing that Melchizedek is Shem, Noah's son. And there's some interesting arguments for that, especially, if Abraham is submitting to him and paying him the tithe because he recognizes Melchizedek as his ancestor, there's some interesting things there. I just don't know if you can ever arrive there definitively, because the text just doesn't explicitly say that.
Exactly.
So that is a view.
More inferential than it is deductive.
Exactly. So I'm not ultimately persuaded by it. The most common view, I think, amongst conservative evangelicals is that Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate Christ. And I think most people take this view because of how mysterious Melchizedek is, and I think because of some of the language in Hebrews 7 that makes it sound like,
or even his name, King of Righteousness.
Yeah, King of Righteousness. There's all these things like in Hebrews 7, which I don't take this view of Hebrews 7, but it almost sounds like he never died, he was never born, right? He's always existed. I don't take that view. Hebrews 7:3 says Melchizedek resembles the Son of God, not that he is the Son of God.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so I think the author of Hebrews is showing us right there that this is not a pre-incarnate Christ. So who is Melchizedek? Well, he is a Gentile priest king. Like, we don't know a lot of details about who he was. I think he was a type. He functions as a type in the biblical storyline of Jesus, but I don't think he is Jesus. I think he was a Gentile priest king who worshiped the creator God and who blessed Abraham and ministered to him. And I think I'm okay to leave it there.
True.
That's so good to point out and interesting, because he's a Gentile priest king, in the fact that his unionship, obviously, of kingship and priesthood.
Jesus is not a Gentile, so he's a Jew. So how could he come? How could he like?
Well, that combined with this was before Israel,
Right. Yeah.
his unionship and who he was, pointing to backwards to Genesis 1 and 2,
Exactly.
was pre-Israel.
Yep.
Actually.
I think that's a big part. That's a big.
Yeah.
That's part of his huge significance. He's a Gentile priest king connected to the Abrahamic covenant, whose very existence and role in the narrative is almost like he embodies what the Abrahamic covenant is about.
Yeah.
Right. Which is God's blessing to the nations, to humanity, of which Melchizedek is like a little microcosm.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. So this is perfect for this question coming up. So for many, the knee-jerk response to the priesthood is that it must come from the line of Aaron. So if you guys have heard, looked into,
he's the only one who can make sacrifices.
Yeah,
the Levites
Aaronautic
just guard. Aaron makes sacrifices.
Right. So if people look into the Aaronautic priesthood, they make sacrifices. But because they were the only people divinely, the Aaronic priests, only people divinely appointed to offer sacrifices in the tabernacle and eventually the temple. And Jesus is a priest who offered himself. So we can see how Jesus is the high priest. However, Psalm 110 describes the messianic king priest must come from the line of Melchizedek. So again, Melchizedek, we're kind of saying is he's not from the line of Aaron. Right. Ultimately fulfilled in the Melchizedek is ultimately fulfilled in the work of Jesus Christ. So why does David point to a priest after the order of Melchizedek and not the Aaronic priesthood?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the answer has to be part of some of the things we've been talking about. There's a uniqueness in terms of redemptive historical placement to Melchizedek's priesthood. So he's attached to Abraham and Abraham's covenant, not to the Mosaic covenant. Okay, so I think that's significant because, it's kind of like Paul talks about in Galatians with.
Yep. Oh yeah. I was hoping you get there.
Yeah. It's just the
law came 430 years after the promise.
Yeah, exactly. The promise. It doesn't nullify the promise, right? So it's similar. I think it's that kind of redemptive historical logic that Paul is using in Galatians that applies to Melchizedek. Melchizedek is associated with the Abrahamic covenant and the promise, which the law does not nullify or set aside. And so his priesthood is attached to Abraham, and it's also not conditioned by the impermanency of the Aaronic priesthood. You think about when they're installed, how long they could serve.
Yep.
Another has to take their office, and it's attached to the Mosaic covenant again. Whereas Melchizedek's priesthood is not grounded in any of that. It seems to be grounded in the covenant with creation. It's grounded in his blessings to Abraham and the Abrahamic promises. And so David is appealing to Melchizedek because what does he say in Psalm 110:4? You are a priest forever. There is something about the Melchizedekian priesthood that is permanent and abiding, not temporary and insufficient. Temporary and insufficient is the language we should attach to the Aaronic priesthood. Permanent and abiding is the nature of Melchizedek's priesthood. And so David is saying that's why the Messiah is going to hold this office. And that's not the only reason. It's because he's going to be a son of David. And David knows those from the line of Judah can't, by law,
that's right.
hold
Be
the Aaronic
priest. Yeah,
priesthood.
that's right.
So for David, there has to be a superior priesthood. If we just say it that way, there has to be a superior priesthood that is going to exist permanently, that functions as a priesthood that lasts forever, that is attached to the promise, and so he's appealing to Melchizedek. And I think Paul's argument in Galatians kind of helps us understand why Melchizedek, why him being attached to Abraham is significant.
It may be helpful before I get to my next question, or actually my last question. And this is pertinent for where you live. And now we're getting into Melchizedek as a priest and his order. I think this is the right place to put it in. So, like, what you have evangelistic conversation with Mormons all the time, like you said. So how does Melchizedek play in kind of Mormon theology, and how do you describe it? Like, how does this help in conversations with Mormons?
Yeah, it's really interesting that a topic that could seem irrelevant for anything but
3 verses in Genesis and then Psalm 110. You're like, you build your ministry in Mormons on that.
Yeah, I know. It's like, it's just in Mormon theology, worthy Mormon males believe that they receive the Aaronic priesthood at age 12, and then the Melchizedekian priesthood, I believe it's at like age 18, if they're worthy of the office.
It's so funny because in the Old Testament, you have to be 30 to be a priest.
Yeah,
not 12.
So yeah, I mean, so they believe themselves to hold both offices, and it gives them certain privileges to perform certain ordinances and ceremonies in the temple and stuff, and certain authority in their household. So
is Hebrews just like, is that left out of their New Testament? They're just, oops, we forgot to put that one in.
The problem with Mormon theology is, I mean, not only do they have extra scriptures, extra revelation, but they are basically taught to not believe the Bible, even though they say they believe the Bible. And so there's no kind of foundation or impetus for reading and studying the Bible. So you got that whole issue. But so if basically every single one of my male Mormon neighbors believes themselves to hold the Aaronic and Melchizedekian priesthood. So I actually was walking down the road a while ago, and one of my neighbors, I actually hadn't met him yet. He lives down the street. He's kind of up the road. He comes up behind me and says, "Hey, I'm supposed to ask you about the Melchizedekian priesthood."
He's supposed to ask you. That's interesting.
Now, what had happened is he had bumped into my wife at the park. He had his kids there, and he was asking my wife some questions, and she was like, "My husband wrote this book and about Melchizedek."
I see. It is just like, I got a revelation from God. I have to tell you about this stuff.
So they'll ask me, and I'll say, "Well, yeah, have you read Hebrews 7? Have you read what the Bible says about this?" No. And I'll say, "Well, Hebrews."
Well, let me tell you about it.
Yeah, Hebrews says, what I'll typically tell them is, Hebrews says that Jesus qualifies for this priesthood on the basis of an indestructible life. So he qualifies for this priesthood because he rose from the dead. And on the basis of this priesthood, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Can you do that? Now, at this point, I usually just get blank stares like, what in the world are you talking about? But my point is, if somebody's going to claim to hold this priesthood, they should probably be able to perform what Jesus is able to do and meet the prerequisite qualifications. But the reality is they don't. And so even though we're kind of being humorous here, it is a real opportunity to share the gospel and the superiority of Christ and the true nature of his salvation. And so I will actually bring up Melchizedek in conversations with Mormon people just to get them thinking. And I wouldn't do that in other settings because
it's not as pertinent.
I mean, what do they care? You're going to take a different approach, right? But But here it is so relevant. And the reality is, it's so it's not just like abstract theology. Like, them holding these priesthood powers matters for like blessing their family.
Hmm.
So it's a very personal issue. And to not have these priesthood powers is like a big deal in their minds that affects their kind of day-to-day family life. So it's a really good angle on evangelism to
It's
LDS
like core of
people.
who they are and what they
Yeah,
do.
and one that we don't often take as evangelicals, because we'll usually focus on other important issues. But I think it is important.
No, that's
Yeah.
extremely helpful.
Very helpful.
Yeah. So that that's kind of helpful for this next question, I guess, because we've been talking about Hebrews and Genesis, but you also have a chapter in your book that talks about the Gospel of Mark and Melchizedek. And I think most people are like, wait, what? That's not quoted in gospel. Like, it's never talks about it. Like, how can you talk about Melchizedek and in the gospel? And I connected it when I read your chapter. I was like, oh my gosh, that's definitely there. And Mark is building off of this priesthood. So can you describe how Mark connects Jesus to Melchizedek explicitly through reference? Because he does reference it, and then implicitly kind of through the shape of the narrative at the end of the gospel.
Yeah. So Jesus is obviously never called or identified as a priest in the Gospels, and that's why there's debate, in academic circles. Is Jesus, a priest in the Gospels? Is he not? I think he is. Again, he's functioning as a priest, right?
Yeah, it can't be dissimilar from like covenant in Genesis 1-3. It's not
exactly. Yeah,
the word's not there, but it's a covenant.
Yeah, I think people have used the illustration for kingship. They've used the illustration of Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. I kind of think of it applies to priestly kingship. It applies to priesthood as well. So the illustration is, throughout the Lord of the Rings, Aragorn is the heir to the throne. Like, he's the king, he's the king, but he's enthroned upon his victory, right? So he kind of takes his seat, so to speak. He takes the fullness of this office once he conquers evil. And I think priesthood is probably similar in the Gospels, in that Jesus, he is the prophet, priest, and king. And upon his cross work, his death and resurrection, then he is kind of enthroned, vindicated as this priestly figure. But so I think in the Gospels, what you find is Jesus doing priestly things. He is casting out unclean spirits in Mark. I think it's interesting. They're called unclean. He makes unclean people clean. He does kind of temple actions outside of the temple. He forgives sins, right? He declares all foods clean. So there's this kind of priestly ministry about his work. Now, he's never again called a priest, or Melchizedek is never referenced. I do make one observation in that chapter, that in Mark 5, one of the unclean spirits refers to Jesus as Son of God Most High. And the language is the construction of Son of God Most High appears at a few places in the Old Testament.
That's right.
And it appears in Genesis 14, priest of Most High God. Right. And so it seems like there's an allusion there, even to that text, to show that Jesus's cleansing of the land of these unclean spirits, he's doing so as a different order of priest. He's doing so as the priest, but him not being from the tribe of Levi, he's this Melchizedekian warrior kind of priest. So I think we get these kinds of hints in the narrative that are meant to show us, this is a priestly Messiah, but he's not of the line of Aaron. So what kind of priestly Messiah is he? Well, he's a priest of a different order. And being a son of David, he's a priest of the Melchizedekian order. And I think now we could talk about as well the end of the narrative.
Yep.
When Jesus comes to the temple, we actually have two references to Psalm 110. So in Mark 12, after all of this conflict, Jesus confounds his enemies by quoting Psalm 110. If the Messiah is David's Lord, if he calls him Lord, how can he also be his son? Right. And
Mhm.
he's saying something about his own identity. I am this son of David and messianic Psalm 110 figure, which evokes the broader context, I
Mhm.
think, which includes you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And he's saying that right there in the temple. And then in Mark 14, when he's being questioned by the high priest, I mean, this is the irony of the passage. It's like, who's the one on trial? Is it Jesus the priest or
Yeah.
just the high
Yeah.
priest?
Yeah.
You know, and Jesus is the one on trial, but it's really like, well, no, Caiaphas is on trial because he's not the true
Mhm.
high priest. Really, Jesus is.
And he's
And
putting to death a clean sacrifice that has not sinned, not for like for the atonement of all people, but he doesn't know that.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
I mean, and finally, after being questioned, Jesus says in Mark 14:62, Jesus said, I am. Well, he's asked, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, that's Psalm 110, and coming with the clouds of heaven. And so it's
Which is
like,
Daniel 7.
which is Daniel
Mhm.
7. So here Jesus weaves together Psalm 110 and Daniel 7 to the high priest. And again, I think when we read these Old Testament references, we don't just limit it to the few words,
Mhm.
the allusion, it's evoking the entire psalm. You think you're the high priest. Actually, I'm the Davidic Messiah and the priest after the order of Melchizedek, and I am Daniel's son of man, right? So I think again, Mark's narrative, Jesus is showing us that no, it's there. He recognizes himself
Mhm.
as this Davidic figure who is going to be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And I don't think it's coincidental that statement occurs when he is before the council talking to the high priest.
Mm.
That's right. Yeah. And then I think this happens in Mark if I have my references right too. But when he gleans from the fields and the people
Yep.
ask him what are you doing, he's like, well, isn't this what David and his disciples did, or David and his people did, which is like you talk about in your book, kind of a priestly activity to do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's people debate, well, was David above the law and Jesus is above the law, or was it that David was in a sense had some as the anointed king and this kind of priestly figure,
Yeah.
some right to do this, and Jesus does as well because he is a priest of the new order, and that's kind of what I argue.
Yeah, so
for.
it's kind of veiled and alluded to, but when you
Yep.
see some of the connections what David's making, you're like,
Right.
oh, like Jesus is filming this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's bringing this all to its climax.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right.
Very good. So we were talking about Hebrews, epistle to the Hebrews earlier in the New Testament, specifically Hebrews 7. And so I guess lastly, you end with a chapter on the epistle to Hebrews in your book, many references to obviously Psalm 110. That's kind of the whole point, and the order of Melchizedek. So if you answered most of this earlier in the conversation, I know, especially with the conversation to the Mormons, you kind of went into this. So if you feel like there's another New Testament book that you could add to this, feel free to. But what does the author of Hebrews say about Melchizedek as he's reflecting on Psalm 110 that both adds to and maneuver the diamond of the gospel into a new light?
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people who listen to this, they're like, okay, I want to study what the New Testament says. Well, like go to Hebrews. I mean, Hebrews 7 is the chapter,
Mm-hmm.
That is all about Melchizedek. And most people get to that chapter and they're just like, what? Why in the
Yeah,
world
you're
is this
doing a
here?
lot of stuff with very little things.
Yeah, like what is going on? But I think it is important to point out Hebrews. Psalm 110 is all over Hebrews. I mean, there's so much we could say. I think if you reduce it to what's the point of the author of Hebrews appealing to the Melchizedekian priesthood, like why is he doing that? Well, his whole argument is to show the superiority of Christ, right? And to tell these people, like, don't go back to old covenant forms of worship. Don't abandon Christ and go back to the law, go back to the old covenant regulations. Jesus is better. And you know what? His priesthood is better. And that's the whole point of Hebrews 7. And his priesthood is better because, like I said earlier, Hebrews 7:16, who became a priest not on the basis of legal requirement concerning bodily descent. Hey, that's what the Aaronic priesthood was about, right? These people inherited this by their genealogy, and they lived and died and they were sinful, and you just had to keep perpetuating this priesthood because of these mortal sinful men. But Jesus became a priest by the power of an indestructible life. So he qualifies for a priesthood on the basis of his resurrection from the dead, because he made purification from sins, Hebrews 1, and sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, and he lives forever. Therefore, this is what I was getting at when I was doing evangelism with Mormons.
Mm-hmm.
What is he able to do? Well, Hebrews 7:25. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Jesus isn't going to lose this office.
Mm-hmm.
He's not going to die and someone else is going to take his place. He rose from the dead. He conquered sin in the grave. He intercedes permanently. And because of his victorious work, he's able to save to the uttermost. Which makes sense why he holds Melchizedek's priesthood, because it's a permanent priesthood.
Yeah.
That's the whole argument. Is Melchizedek, earlier in Hebrews 7, the author's like, again, when he's talking about Melchizedek not having father or mother or beginning of days or end of life.
People get confused with like the pre-incarnate stuff.
Yeah, what's the point of what the author is saying? He's like, go read Genesis. What does Genesis say about Melchizedek's parents? Nothing. What does Genesis say about Melchizedek's genealogy? Nothing. What do we know about Melchizedek from Genesis? He lives. Like, that's all we know. He just appears.
Yeah.
He just appears with this priesthood and blesses Abraham. And so the point is, the nature of this Melchizedekan priesthood is permanency. That's the whole function of it. It lasts. It's enduring. It blesses Abraham, right? And so Jesus qualifies for this superior priesthood, this permanent priesthood, because he conquered sin and death and rose from the dead. And so this is actually a very glorious truth for Christians to rejoice in, that Christ qualifies for a priesthood that is able to unleash the promises of the Abrahamic covenant permanently to the nations. And he holds this office permanently and can save to the uttermost, not the mostly most, but the uttermost, anyone who draws near to God through him, since he always lives, always lives. And that's the logic of Hebrews 7.
And
there you go.
It is, Melchizedek is, the order of Melchizedek is older than the Aaronic priesthood. Yeah. And the Aaronic priesthood did not nullify the Melchizedek.
Oh.
The Aaronic priesthood was
just not the same line. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It served its purpose under the law of Moses during its time. And then, but the line of Melchizedek, like you said, was older than that. And it's still going on today through Christ. And it connects the beginning and the end of scripture and redemptive history. It connects Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation to Christ's ultimate fulfillment, him coming back and everything, where it ends where it started, and it ends better than where it started.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And on, you read Hebrews, a lot of Jesus's priestly ministry is presented as a fulfillment of the Aaronic priesthood, which I haven't explicitly stated in this conversation.
Yeah.
Jesus fulfills the kind of duties and responsibilities that are evident in the Aaronic priesthood. I mean, Day of Atonement is a big kind of typology that Jesus fulfills, right? And so he fulfills that Aaronic priesthood, and then he holds a priesthood of a different order.
Yeah, he's able to fulfill it because he's of a different order.
Yeah, he brings that Mosaic priesthood, that Mosaic covenant, that Mosaic law to its fulfillment, and he holds the office of a permanent priesthood that carries forward, that isn't brought to completion, that is attached to Abraham. I mean, Hebrews even says, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood,
it would have been attained.
The law, what further need would there have been for another priesthood to arise after the order of Melchizedek? And he says, when there's a change in the priesthood, there's a change in the law, right? And so the whole argument of Hebrews is that, look, the old covenant has been fulfilled, which means that priesthood is done, the Aaronic priesthood. Jesus holds something better, something abiding, something permanent.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Yeah, he couldn't have been because he's from the line of Judah, so he can't be a priest. But if he were a priest, he couldn't. If he were a priest after the line of Levi, he could have made sacrifices. But if he were a priest after the line of Aaron, he couldn't have made an abiding sacrifice. If he's of the same priesthood, he couldn't fulfill that priesthood. So since he's of the order of a different priesthood of Melchizedek, he can fulfill. So it's if you don't like see that kind of inner logic that Hebrews is using, you miss. He has to be of a different order in order for him to fulfill that order.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So I would encourage people to read Hebrews 7 and reflect on it, and don't, just rush through it, because
it's not just, I think when people say like, oh, he's better than this, it's like, no, he's not better. He's like, he transcends and he fulfills this because he's of a different covenantal administration than the Aaronic is.
Yeah, I think that's
it's not just like, oh, the Old Testament's like good, but Jesus is better, or like the old the covenant of works is good, but Jesus is better. It's like, no, it's fulfilled because it's of a different covenantal administration.
Yep.
Which doesn't make for a good sermon title. It's Jesus is better makes for a much better sermon title than some of these ones do.
No, that's good though. Yeah, hopefully this is helpful. I know it can be kind of a difficult topic, which is why, I mean, Melchizedek remains a mystery, I think, still to most people. It is a difficult topic, but I think I quote Carson in there, who said in a sermon once that
that's right. Yeah.
He's one of the most instructive figures for helping us put our Bibles together. And if we really spend some time reflecting on him and how Psalm 110 uses him, Hebrews uses him, it does help us to see, like, this is how we put the Bible together.
Exactly. Yeah. So now I think it's a lot easier for those who, like, conservative evangelicals or Bible believing evangelicals, Reformed, or like kind of whatever stripe they're of. Like, you trust what David's saying is right. And you trust what the author of Hebrews saying is right, but you're just not sure, like, well, how did you get there?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And I think this book is going to be really helpful for how they got there. They're not just pulling like the proverbial theological rabbit out of the hat and saying, like, look what I got because I have the Spirit in me.
Right.
It's they're reading the inner logic, which they're instructing us how to do the same thing. And so you can do the same thing when you're listening to this, reading through the Bible and using kind of their same interpretive model. Say, like, oh yeah, I see what you're doing.
Yeah, that's that's part of my my goal in in asking the questions I asked and writing this book, is I want people to help people to understand how to read the Bible better. And when we understand how the biblical authors themselves interpret the Bible, then we will be better readers of the Bible. But if we just quickly default to, oh, they're inspired and they had insight that we can never attain.
Yeah.
I don't think that's right. Yes, they're inspired, but they were interpreting the Bible legitimately.
Yeah. I think we're so used to like atomistic reading, not atomistic, but atomistic reading. Yeah. So we read stuff out of context. We have our favorite verse, which are great, or we have a favorite chapter, but we tend to read that chapter in and of itself and don't see the inner logic of that chapter and how the author's using different references, all that stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so I hope if there's some usefulness to this book, some of its usefulness will be with regards to just helping people become better interpreters.
Yeah, and you do mention in your book too, it makes a lot of sense that Western culture just doesn't get it. Really, they have a hard time resonating.
We don't have monarchs. We specifically we specifically annexed ourselves from monarchs, so we don't have to go through some of this stuff.
So we have Western culture has a hard time understanding Old Testament Jewish priesthood.
Yeah.
And then
royalty,
and then,
all that stuff.
And then kingship, like we don't really have kings the way that you would talk about too in the world today. So it's kind of, there's two different offices that people have a hard time defining. And then you say, on top of that, combine them into one person. And they're like, what? And so
we don't even know what either of those are. And then to combine in one person makes no sense.
Yeah, the culture gap is so big, right, between modern Western civilization and these kind of ancient priestly people think, oh, this is, not Christians, but people think, oh, that's like witchcraft. They're just, I think it's like some kind of, pre-modern, unenlightened way of living. And so we're just so detached from it that it makes it more difficult for us to wrap our minds around, but that's just all the more encouragement to press into the Bible and the glories of Christ and understand who he is and what he accomplished.
Yeah, definitely. So Dr. Emadi, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book, writing your book, and coming on our show to talk about it and what people's appetites for it. Maybe to end, where can people find you? Where are you, like, where's your church located? All that good stuff.
Yeah, so I'm the pastor of Crossroads Church in Sandy, Utah. So crossroadschurchutah.org. If anyone wants to listen to some of the sermons on there. But yeah, I encourage people to get the book if they're interested. If you're ever in Utah, come through Sandy, come visit us at Crossroads.
Yeah,
I'd love to say hi.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Emadi, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for this conversation. Yeah, I really do think people are going to come away with a better understanding of Melchizedek, and I think a better understanding of Christ and the offices that he fulfills and what he's done for them, because it can be confusing, but I think this book really helpfully integrates these things, not in a kind of haphazard kind of let's put all this stuff together, but in a inner logic of scripture kind of way.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you guys having me on. And, like I said, if anyone does read the book and has questions, I'm happy to correspond with people. If anyone goes to our website, crossroadschurchutah.org, there's a contact us. I can get those
they can argue with you on Melchizedek and he's pre-incarnate, and you can say, let's go through this.
And this will be on YouTube too, so we get some comments and questions on YouTube under the video, so you can see those as well.
Great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.